started. I think. All right. So first of all, thank you all for coming today. Please stay muted during the presentation so that phone calls and private discussions do not interrupt any of the presentations. We want to thank our extension partners. Without their support, we would not be able to bring you programs like these throughout the year, and especially during these last 2 years during COVID. If you're interested in supporting any of our extension efforts, please, you can email David Block, Anita Oberholster, or myself. I'd also like to thank Nate Weis and Ron Runnebaum for sharing their expertise and their time today. And I'd also like to thank Caroline for helping with the registration logistics. If you would like to ask a question live, there are a couple ways to do this, and they're shown here. You can type the question into the chat box, or you can raise your hand in Zoom by clicking on the reactions button on your screen, and we will call on you to ask a question. Closed captioning is enabled, and you can turn it on and off with the button marked CC or live transcript. And last, but certainly not least, please take a moment to complete the survey in the chat box at the end of the program, or you can fill it out by following the link when we send you the recording of today's program. Your feedback is important to us, and it helps us to provide relevant and informative content. And also, the recording of today's program will be emailed to you within 48 hours. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chair and Professor David Block, and he's going to introduce our speakers today.
I get the idea that Dave did not memorize the bios.
No, just all right. Sorry about that. It's the logistics of sitting back to back or computer to computer across the table and not causing a whole bunch of reverb. So thank you. It's my pleasure today to introduce our two speakers to talk to you about sustainable winemaking. Our first speaker is Professor Ron Runnebaum, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Viticulture and Enology and has been since 2015. Ron got his bachelor's in chemical engineering from Notre Dame, followed by 8 years in industry with Procter & Gamble working on consumer products, after which he found his, what I'm going to call his true calling of wine, and came to the department to get his master's degree in viticulture enology, which he did, followed by a PhD in chemical engineering, also at UC Davis. When he finished his PhD, he completed a postdoc at University of California, Berkeley, and then entered the energy industry for a startup company before joining us. Here at Davis, he works on all kinds of different aspects of sustainable processing for winemaking, in addition to his work on catalysis, which is the topic of his PhD and his postdoc. So it's great to have Ron with us today. And our other speaker today is Nate Weis. Nate is a Napa Valley native whose father is also a winemaker. He graduated with honors from UC Santa Barbara with a bachelor's degree in biopsychology and neuroscience. He followed that with some internships at wineries and harvest work prior to coming back to school and getting his master's degree in viticulture enology from UC Davis. Afterwards, he worked for Etude and Patson Hall, followed by becoming the winemaker at Antica for Antinori here in the Napa Valley. And following that, he joined Silver Oak, where he still is today. He's now responsible for managing the operations in Napa Valley and the Alexander Valley, among other places, from grape to bottle. And he's also an ambassador for their brand. I should mention he also earned a MBA in wine business from Sonoma State University along the way. And we're very happy to have him with us because, as I hope he'll be talking about, he operates the 2 other LEED Platinum certified wineries in the world other than ours, the 2 first commercial LEED Platinum wineries. And so we're very honored to have him here joining us as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron and Nate to talk to you about sustainable winemaking.
Great, thanks, Dave. I think I will go first and talk a little bit about some of the efforts going on here at UC Davis. And yes, very happy, that Nate has decided to join us today in having a conversation with him about this office hours session. One of the things that he pointed out was that, while there have been a number of different sessions on sustainability that often require new infrastructure, one of the topics that has been covered to a lesser degree is things that can help many wineries, take their first steps down that path. And while that's not necessarily something that we're often focused on in academia, I would like to share a little bit about what we're working on today, and then transition that into some of the work that's been going on at Silver Oak Cellars, that includes some significant infrastructure work with new buildings and so forth, but they also have a lot of experience with a lot of the other things that wineries can start to do to start down their path of being more sustainable. So one of the things, I guess, that has changed or been modified in my mind since I've been at UC Davis is sort of extending this concept of sustainability beyond just long-term sustainability. So when I came in, of course, the department, had goals and facilities that are putting us on a path for, having, kind of net zero water, net zero energy. And these are, of course, important concepts that we need to continue to work on, both on campus as an industry, related to increasing prices of energy, decreasing availability of water. But one of the things that has also become quite apparent is for us to extend that to think about sustainability on the short term. So how do we be sustainable, not just financially, but also from a standpoint of energy, water and labor, over the next day, over the next week. This becomes oftentimes quite apparent, when we have unexpected, external events like power outages, where we maybe have the capacity to, generate on-site energy, but how do we use that, in the short term so that we can get through the day, get through the week, and so forth. And so we're often thinking about these various aspects in different areas, such as energy, water, and labor, as well as others. And so, we are very fortunate at UC Davis to have some nice infrastructure. I just want to point this out from the standpoint that I really think that it helps the department hopefully have greater impact on things in the industry, because this gives us the opportunity and the capacity to take things outside of the lab or beyond the lab and bench scale and into a pilot scale or somewhat more commercial like setting. And so, of course, one of the, it's always great to be able to have new infrastructure to minimize, your energy needs and be more efficient. But I think for us as a department, it's helpful to have these this infrastructure and these assets so that we can demonstrate some of these new technologies and approaches at a scale that's more relevant to many of you in industry. And so some of the things that we've been working on, of course, are things that maybe you've heard about already, such as our on-site generation and storage, which more and more wineries are able to include in their infrastructure. But some of the other things that we're continuing to work on that are quite exciting is that we recently had a bid awarded for working with us to further develop capability and fabricate clean in place approaches for cleaning winery fermenters. That's going to enable us to demonstrate improved water reuse, reduced labor for cleaning, and hopefully demonstrate more reproducible cleaning so that you can clean tanks when nobody's at the winery. Another thing that we're continuing to work on that's sort of complementary to that is investigating alternative chemicals for cleaning. So the intent here is that we can demonstrate and understand the use of clean chemistry that can also be recycled and reused. So not just stopping at recycling and reusing water, but also reusing the chemistry so that we're not disposing of that through different channels. We also have a couple of projects related to reducing wine loss by adapting technologies to inline processes such as fluidized bed crystallizer. And then we also had a recent publication last year that was helping us extend our understanding of utilizing ion exchange resins for removing proteins from wine. We're happy that Jackson Family is continuing their support for investigating approaches for capturing CO2 from winery fermentations. And then lastly, I think one of these areas that I guess I've added to sustainability has been labor. And that's really been from this kind of insight that we can't lose sight of sustainability on the short term when we're also thinking about sustainability on the longer term. And so we also have a number of projects related to sensors in the winery. So this would complement sensors in the vineyard, of course, but sensors in the winery and automation, so that winemakers can have more and more information at their fingertips, maybe before they even get into the winery in the morning to help everyone make more decisions, especially when labor might be short. So I know a number of those things that we're working on here at UC Davis are taking advantage of this infrastructure that we have and are often ideas that require more fundamental research and time, and training of students. And so was very happy that Nate had a really good idea that in addition to maybe covering some of the nice infrastructure that they have at their wineries, also including some of the things that they've been doing or some of the things that they've learned along the way that can potentially be first steps or easy next steps, relatively easy next steps for many others in the wine industry, so that all of us can continue on this path of more sustainable winemaking. So Nate, I would like to turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you, Ron. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. I got to point out, I see my dad on the Zoom call. Dad, good to see you. I'm very impressed you were able to figure out Zoom. Well done. So he no longer is a winemaker. He's now officially retired, but as all winemakers do, officially retirement means you're consulting and doing all sorts of other stuff as well. So including being grandpa. So my name is Nate Weis. My title is the Vice President of Winegrowing for Silver Oak, Toomey, Ovid, and Timeless, sort of the Duncan family of wines. And as Ron sort of introed, I think it's important to tell you a little bit about what we do, but I think it's important for everybody on this call to talk a little bit about how people where can you start? So a lot of the things we're going to talk about are really big picture ideas that required significant investments and a lot of planning, but I think we'll wrap it up talking about what you could do tomorrow in your own winery. So just to review, sustainability as an ethos or a model. This is my favorite sort of simplification of it, which is basically, we called it the 3 Ps of sustainability. So we have the people involved. So, especially over the last few years, this has become a much more critical part. And it's one of the things I love about sustainability is from the very beginning, the people part of being sustainable was always important to them. Things like social equity and engagement and happiness and all that was always an important part of the sustainability model. I think when people think about sustainability, we think about the planet part a lot, and that's a lot of probably most of what we're going to talk about today are the practices both in the vineyard and in the winery that are related to tackling things like climate change and reducing inputs and pollution and so on. But again, I think the important part of sustainability is it's a holistic model that makes you think about every part of your business and not just that. And then, of course, the profit part, which is one thing that people often forget, is that it's not very sustainable if we can't keep doing it for a long time. And the only way we can keep doing it for a long time is by being successful and making it profitable. So, a lot of people like to talk about the journey and the road, and it's a little bit cliche. I love to think about sustainability, at least in my own experience, working for Silver Oak especially, as more of a snowball. And it reminds me of something that Warren Buffett once said about life being an awful lot like a snowball, and the important part is really just finding some wet snow on a really, really long hill. And I think our journey through sustainability has been a lot like that. As we've picked up some steam and rolled downhill, we've had some small wins, we've seen some results, we've done more implementation, seen even bigger wins, bigger successes. And those things just lead to more questions and bigger goals, which I think is a beautiful part of sustainability in general, is that curiosity and sort of looking at what's next, what's the next thing that we can tackle. So I like to think of it as a snowball rolling downhill. And for us, where we started, the snowball really started to pick up steam. It's always been part of the Duncan family's ethos. They're outdoorsmen. They're from the state of Colorado, which of course is nature and the environment have always been important to people in Colorado as a big outdoorsy state. But it really started to pick up steam for us in 2006. And that top photo is a fire that we had at our Oakville winery that necessitated essentially the tearing down and rebuilding of this winery in the late 2000s. At the same time, in the bottom, we were really living by this ethos of just something Justin Meyer said a long time ago, which was, we have yet to make our best bottle of wine. And so this idea of continuous improvement is almost drilled into everybody that works here in every sense of the word. We have yet to write our best marketing email. We have yet to, provide our best experience to our customers. And we have yet to grow our best grape and make our best wine. So a lot of our journey into sustainability had very little to do with altruism and the need to take care of the environment, but a lot to do with making better wine. And so about the same time as our new winery in Oakville opened back up, we were also chasing new technologies, new ideas about how to grow better grapes, make the grapes we were growing, make better wine. On the bottom, that's a sap flow sensor. So irrigation was kind of where we started. I think it has the dual benefit of using less water, which is of course good in California and very important, but also making better wine, which was really our goal. And as I was saying, it's sort of, the more we sort of delved into these things, the more we started to ask more questions about other parts of our business and other things that we were doing. So this is where kind of the Jefferson Airplane part of it starts, and we start chasing that rabbit down the hole. So where has this taken us from sap flow sensors and irrigation? We're now doing all sorts of different stuff. So we've opened a new winery in Alexander Valley. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but we had very, very important and challenging sustainability goals with that for sure. We started to examine what we were doing in the vineyards in terms of using herbicides. Are there alternatives to herbicides? How are they going to work for us? Where can we put them to use? How effective are they? How expensive are they? Asking a lot of questions around that, which of course led to things like talking about carbon farming, modeling carbon systems, and looking at regenerative farming. Which also led us to the idea of joining IWCA. So the International Wineries for Climate Action was an organization that's relatively new and started by the Jackson family as well as the Torres family out of Spain. And we were early members. We jumped on board really quick because it was asking a lot of questions. IWCA has a lot of very big goals, including reducing carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. And becoming entirely climate positive as a business by 2050. Those are big goals for us. We're not entirely sure how we're going to get there, which is part of the really interesting part of all this is we're going to have to figure that out as we go along. But it's been a fascinating process in terms of taking carbon inventories, thinking about ways we can reduce our carbon emissions, either in farming, in packaging and distribution, in the winemaking process, and so on. And just kind of looking at everything that we do across the whole business. So the Alexander Valley Estate was a big step for us. The family bought this property in 2012, and we were finally able to open the winery in 2017. So we had a lot of time for design and planning, and there was a lot of thought that went into it. And along the way, we came across something called the Living Building Challenge. We always knew we wanted to copy UC Davis and chase that LEED Platinum concept, and the engineers and consultants and everybody are very familiar with LEED. So that was not that challenging. They knew exactly what we needed to do and how we needed to do it to reach those goals, which were lofty in and of themselves to get to the platinum level. The Living Building Challenge was something completely different that had essentially much less of a roadmap for you, but it basically laid out a bunch of goals and said, these are the things you need to do if you want to be certified. Apply it to your project and figure out how you're going to do it. And most living buildings had been apartment buildings or office buildings, things like that. Certainly never a manufacturing plant, and definitely not a manufacturing of this plant of this size. We were about 100,000 square feet in terms of the total project. And so there are a lot of aspects to the Living Building Challenge, but I think the most interesting ones for us and the hardest ones to figure out how we were going to reach had to do with energy, which was not that hard. The idea was that you had to be net positive energy, so you had to produce more energy than you use. Which was a fairly simple calculation. We need to figure out how we can produce energy and where we're going to use it and how much we're going to use, and make sure one of those numbers was bigger than the other, the photovoltaic panels. The other was materials. So there was sort of a red list idea, much like if you may have heard of this through Google, where there was a list of things that you couldn't include in the project at all. So every single material that came onto the job site had to be vetted. There was a proportion of materials that had to be recycled. There was a proportion that had a number attached to it based on how close the material was produced and shipped from. And so that was a very challenging process, just in the sense we had to go through with every one of our contractors and subcontractors and look at every piece of material they were bringing onto site, inventory that, look into it, make sure it met the red list materials need. So that was just a matter of time. The really interesting one and the hard one for us was net zero water. And net zero water is essentially a calculation of how much water you're putting into the aquifer versus how much you're taking out. Of course, being a winery, we need to use water. Water is very important to us. Having a winery that does not operate with water is not a very good idea and probably impossible. But we approached our engineers and said, how can we accomplish this sort of thing in a winery, an actual physical winery that's operating the way that we want to operate and making the wines that we want to make? And what they came up with was essentially recycling our processed wastewater. So the picture on the top right is our membrane bioreactor, which is an on-site wastewater plant. I always joke with David Duncan that I've worked in a number of wineries that are smaller than this wastewater plant that we built, but the treatment of wastewater on site isn't really new or unique or anything like that. The way that we use it is. So after treatment, this wastewater is filtered both via sort of a membrane filter and then with carbon filtration. It's UV treated and softened, and it comes back into the winery. So if you visit this winery during harvest and you see everybody cleaning up at the end of the day, you'll see them using a purple hose on a traditional looking hose bib. So we have purple hose bibs and we have cream hose bibs. The cream is potable water, and the purple obviously is recycled processed wastewater. So as they're washing down equipment or cleaning the floor or doing things like that, it's all recycled processed wastewater that's being used. And by doing this, we were able to limit our potable gallons used to essentially a gallon of water per gallon of wine, which was something that first off, I thought was very impressive, and I wasn't sure we were going to be able to do. But second of all, I really didn't think was possible, to be perfectly honest. So I was quite impressed by that. So, in terms of talking about our approach to sustainability, obviously not everybody has a chance to build a winery from the ground up. Not everybody has complete support from ownership that sustainability is an important part of their ethos and an important part of their company culture and who they are. But what can you do if you're working for a winery that maybe has less resources, maybe wants to get started somewhere? And I think that's really the key is you got to start somewhere. Tackle little things, get small wins. It's kind of a how do you eat an elephant sort of question, and the answer is one bite at a time. So when it comes to water use in the winery, I think the most important thing, and I have to thank Aaron from Jackson Family Wines, who's been a great collaborator on a number of things with me related to water use. You got to start measuring. You can't manage what you don't measure, which I think is the critical factor when it comes to water use in the winery. So even if you can't create a wastewater plant and recycle your processed wastewater and use it back in the winery, you can at least find out where your water is going. How much are you using? How much goes to landscaping? How much is sort of domestic use for other parts of the winery? And then in the production facility itself, how much are you using there? Just about anybody can go in and install a few water meters for a fairly insignificant amount of money. 3 or 4 typically in a winery site will be enough to really figure out where all your water is going. And one of the ways it can be justified is water's not free. Even if you're not paying for water directly, you're paying for it indirectly in one way or another. And you may be paying more for it, especially if you're in California in the future. So there is a return on investment here in terms of figuring out where it's going and finding out how to reduce it. So Aaron had this chart on the right there. That's the green is 1 year before they implemented some water saving measures. The blue is the following year, implementing new water saving measures based entirely on reducing the amount that they're using for whatever. And you can see that you can make a fairly significant impact, and the goal is really to figure out where your hotspots are. So what are the big water sinks? Things like barrel washing, of course, is important. Sanitation is important. Figuring out new ways to do things, and if you want to go really low tech, I think down on the bottom, one thing that any winery anywhere can do is just go down to the hardware store, and I guarantee you, if you have a winery, you have a squeegee or two, but do you have 15? Do you have 20? What we've found is that when we've really needed to reduce water use, and it's not just because we want to reduce water use, in some cases we run out of water in our winery facilities and wells have run dry. Basically, chasing berries around at the end of a harvest day, that's a huge use of water. So welcome to the winery. Here's your squeegee. Here's your pressure washer, high pressure, low flow. Hot water is your best friend when it comes to cleaning. It can help remove soils much quicker and much more easily with a lot less water use. So when it comes to water, first understanding where things are going, and then starting to tackle those areas that are really kind of consuming the most is the place to start. And then there's another of other steps as well that I think are important. So I think when it comes to sustainability and the planet part of it, certainly, upgrading lighting is a big step, even if it's one fixture at a time. I know most wineries, when you start looking and you start adding up all the different fixtures or ballasts you need to replace, if you want to go to high efficiency lighting, it can turn into a very big number. So just eat that elephant one bite at a time. Every year, replace 2 fixtures. Every year, make a little bit of improvement incrementally. And there's a return on investment in this. So I don't know the current state of things like photovoltaic panels or rebates for upgrading lighting, but over the years, there's been a lot of interest in municipalities and utilities in terms of helping people do this with rebates, be they tax rebates or some other sort of rebate. There's a lot of support out there for people. There's people that want to help you get through this process and upgrade these things. And if photovoltaic is a fairly big investment, if that's not feasible for you or your winery, you can also talk to your utility and ask them about the opportunity to buy clean energy only. So renewable energy, it usually comes with increased rates, but it's one step you can take to start to use more and more clean energy if you can't produce it yourself. Things like waste stream audits are always very interesting. typically your waste management provider will be more than happy to do an audit. Audit's a fancy word for dumpster diving, essentially. They come in and they dig through your trash and you help them out and you figure out what you're not recycling that you could, how much trash are you producing? Is that a reasonable number for a facility with the number of employees or the size that you are? And start to tackle those things with your employees. Getting involved in third-party programs, I think, is one of the really important and interesting parts of increasing sustainability and improving. What I find is, while there's a lot of paperwork, there certainly is a lot of effort that gets put into being part of these organizations. There's a lot of really good ideas, and there's often a lot of ideas you haven't thought of. Things like, testing your emitters in the vineyard to be sure that they're putting out the amount of water that you think they're putting out, and not more or less. Which actually is a very critical part of wine quality too. That could be a big boon to you in terms of your irrigation strategy. And they're all over the place. CSWA, Lodi Rules, SIP, Napa Green. There's many, many more of these third-party organizations that are more than happy to get you involved, put you through the process, share ideas and best practices with you. And that's really what they're all about, is what are the best practices out there, and here's a nice thick book that's got all of them contained in one spot. And I think the last part that's really important is culture. So up top, there's a photo of a couple trophies. So again, I think Jackson Family Wines is a great example for everybody about a company that really takes this seriously and puts their money where their mouth is. And part of their, they had a great idea about culture building around sustainability and water use, which was, let's create a trophy for the winery that uses the least amount of water in a given month or a given year. And this trophy is going to get passed around, and they incentivize behaviors that really help build sustainability and put it into practice. And I think that's important for any culture, is number one, put sustainability on that level with profitability, with wine quality, with safety, all those things. I think being sustainable can be up there as one of those priorities for your company. I think, in years like 2020 and 2021, and probably 2022, water use is going to be up there for us for sure, because I have a feeling we're going to run out of water in a couple of places again. So water use has to be right up there with everything else that you do, probably right up there alongside safety is one of the most important things we'll do from day to day. And then I think it's important to come back to the people P of sustainability and talk about culture and building culture in general. So I think this comes down to leadership and leadership potential. And I think it's just important to note that in terms of building a strong culture, making people feel appreciated and engaged and happy. And, let's face it, we all got into the wine business hopefully not to get rich, because that hasn't really materialized, I would assume, for most of us, but because it's fun. It's something we're passionate about. It's something we enjoy. It's something we think adds something to the world. So let's create environments where people are happy and excited to come to work every day. And I think leadership, it's often, people think about leadership as being at the top of organizations, but I think there's plenty of people at the bottom of organizations or in the middle that have just as much capacity and ability to lead as anybody else. In some cases, probably more in those middle and lower parts of organizations. And so you can lead the people around you, can lead your peers, the people you work with, the people that work for you, and create those little pockets of a great and positive culture. So anyway, I hope that was useful and maybe gave some of you an idea or a few ideas, but that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Nate. That was great. You answered so many of my questions, but anyway, something that I noticed, and that is the conundrum a little bit. It's like when you were talking about water savings, and you mentioned that obviously, and I was immediately thinking it's like people using steam to clean barrels, which is great, and it uses less water. Cleaning using heated water because it's much more efficient at lifting up the soil than cold water. But the conundrum is obviously you're using way more energy. You're saving water, but you're using way more energy. And it's always that compromise between the two, because you're trying to be sustainable. but the one that's good for the one is bad for the other one. And I suppose that's when it helps, when you know you're at least creating your own energy, right? If you have solar panels. But I think that's an important thing to always, that balancing act about which give you the most, I think, advantage or makes you the most sustainable. And I don't know if you have any tricks or help for people to make that decision, and it probably would be unique depending on your own environment.
Yeah, it's funny. I talk a lot about sustainability. I was on a seminar last night for the Wine Institute about sustainability. And that's one of the things that the more you go down that rabbit hole, the more you find that there's always trade-offs. There's always weighing this versus that. And so and there's not a right answer or a wrong answer necessarily. I think it actually comes down to your values and what's important to you, what's important to your organization. You're exactly right in that, not only as part of the Living Building Challenge, not only were there a lot of other things about water use and energy use and net positive energy, but one of the intricacies of their framework is they don't allow combustion. They don't want you to use combustion in any form. So no fireplace in the tasting room, no boiler. So that was another very big engineering challenge for us, was how are we going to produce hot water and sanitize and sterilize without using a traditional boiler. So that was one of the challenges we threw to our engineers, and they came up with a fascinating system for producing hot water that included solar preheating, CO2 heat pumps. It's connected into the refrigeration system. So the hot side of the refrigeration system dumps into the hot water system, and the cold side of the hot water system dumps into refrigeration. And it's, where the traditional sort of diagram of the hot water system is basically a page long in a lot of engineering sets of plans. Ours was about 20 pages long because there were just pipes and things and valves going everywhere. But we knew that we were going to be net positive energy. And so it just became a matter of, that's a trade-off that we're going to have to make. And all we're going to need to do is find places to put solar panels and make sure that they're efficient enough to produce what they need to produce. So, but there's all these trade-offs all the time. One thing that came up last night was a discussion around carbon sequestration and tillage, which of course I think we understand fairly well about what the best practices are there. But one of the questions was about wildfires and how that affects wildfires, which is now part of our lexicon and something important to us. And yeah, sure enough, cover crop, permanent cover crop dries out at the end of the season and it burns. I can tell you from experience, it burns really well. So you have to, that's another trade-off. One thing we've discussed is, should we be cultivating late in the season when we wouldn't normally, just to reduce fire risk?
Yeah, it's important. It's another important factor to keep in mind, and it will be depending on where you are. If you're in a hot place with a high fire risk, you probably need to make sure that you don't have cover crops, dried out cover crops, close to harvest and fire season. It's true. Everything is a trade-off. But what you did mention, and I think it's very interesting, is that if you have the money and you can start from scratch, there's some brilliant ideas out there to help you be more sustainable. But if you don't, and you have what you have, there's small ways in which you can become more sustainable. And then you really have to think about these trade-offs even more.
So, one thing being part of IW today that's been fascinating is in going through these inventories of greenhouse gases. Packaging and distribution are a huge, huge part of it for every winery that's involved in this organization that looks at this closely. And any winery can reduce the weight of their bottle. And, if you can do one thing tomorrow, reduce the weight of your bottle by 15% if you can. If you're using, an 800 gram bottle, find something that's 500 grams. That's probably as big a difference as a lot of the things that we're doing on a much larger scale.
Good point. Yeah.
So I just want to remind people, you're welcome to put questions in chat, or to go to the reactions and raise your hand. And I think we do have a question here. So Paul is asking, what surprised you most when you did this is for Nate, I'm sorry. What surprised you most when you did your waste stream audit, and what did you find gave you the biggest bang for the buck for reducing your solid waste stream?
That's a really good question, Paul. to be honest, what surprised me is we found our employees actually were very efficient about their waste. There was not a lot of low-hanging fruit there in terms of things that were being recycled or weren't being recycled that should have been. I think one thing that we did realize is there was a lot of stuff that was compostable that we were throwing away, or our employees were throwing away. And, of course, it all comes back to culture and behavior. So creating ways to make composting of food scraps and things like that much easier for everybody. It's sort of a pain for some people around the winery that have to sort of deal with it. But the beauty of it is, in any organization, there's people who also feel really strongly about this stuff and are more than willing to spend time taking out the trash, sort of literally and figuratively when it comes to that. So creating that, and then also looking for we have a culture based on fun and get-togethers, which of course the last couple of years have been hard. But when we opened Alexander Valley, we started looking really closely at bringing in things like, if we're using silverware, disposable silverware, making sure that's compostable, basically bringing everything compostable into the process that we could. So unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of low-hanging fruit otherwise, which I'm an optimist by nature, so I like to think that means our employees are already being really, really efficient about how they manage their waste.
So I have another question for both of you. For Ron, I would phrase it, looking at all the things that you're working on in sustainability, what do you look at, what do you see as having the biggest impact long-term and maybe short-term? And for Nate, I would ask the question, of all the things that you've already tried, what do you think gave you the biggest success, and what would you not do again if there's anything that you wouldn't do again? Okay, so maybe we can start with Ron.
Yeah, I guess, some of the things that I'm working on that I think would be quite important that most people don't think about is, taking some of these treatments that are out of tank, where you might have leftover wine that is either downgraded or goes into a waste stream. And so, this is, I think, something that enabled Treasury to justify working on fluidized bed crystallizers, just because of the wine that's remaining at the end of these treatments. And so if you start thinking about, that wine being formed by maybe irrigated vines at some point, which happens in a good amount of the state, we're using as an industry a lot of water, just to maybe grow grapes that are then going to be downgraded at another point in time. And so, would we be able to save a lot of water from that standpoint by looking at some of the practices that we're doing in the winery? I think longer term, we're seeing more and more challenges related to labor. I know that's kind of a theme that's come up and a focus for us as a department since I've been here. And so, I was actually just had a question for Nate. I know that you've seemed to do a number of audits. I guess, have you done any audits on kind of where people are using their time in the winery? And maybe that's, not just that they're, using it to, track down that last berry, but, being more is there ways of being more thoughtful about how people are using their time? If that's a precious resource, maybe there's not as many interns as there used to be. And at least in auditing that, are there ways that we could consider, introducing sensors or automation that would help assist, the winemaking staff in making higher quality wine, with some of the advances in technologies that have really been accelerating over the last 5 or 10 years.
So let's see, I'll tackle those one by one, but so as far as tracking people and how they use their time, no, I've always sort of envisioned maybe doing something like that, but it seems awfully intrusive, and I think it's probably not consistent with who we want to be as an employer. As much as for me, it would just be out of curiosity as to where are the time sinks? What do we spend a lot of time doing? Are there ways to eliminate that? We have done a lot of automation of a lot of different processes, cap management during harvests, which had kind of the added benefit of allowing for natural disasters and the ability to keep making wine during natural disasters, which certainly wasn't why we did it, but ended up being a really good result of that. I'm sorry, the other question was about, ask it again, Ron.
I think you've answered my question about sort of, yeah, maybe it's not completely tracking people's time, but at least tracking some of the types of work that they're doing, I guess, and the amount of time it takes to do that instead of, yeah, tracking them for the entire day. I think Dave.
The other way to do it is essentially to take resources away until something breaks, essentially.
Okay.
So it's a very difficult and challenging way to do things. It doesn't make you super popular, but yeah, it's always an interesting question. And how much labor do we actually need? How, you know, where is that inflection point where we go from understaffed to overstaffed, right?
So yeah, and I'd asked, you know, kind of what do you think you did that gave you the kind of the biggest bang for your buck? And is there something that you did that you spent a lot of time and money on that you're not sure you would do again, if there's anything like that?
I insist, I always threaten I'm going to write a memoir someday about all the stupid things I've done in my career, and the book's just getting longer and longer every year. But, I'll say this, sustainable green paints is not particularly effective as paints. We have certainly noticed that this green building requires a lot more maintenance when it comes to aesthetics. So that has been a bit of a challenge and something that caught us by surprise. It's the same is true of the wastewater plant. It's difficult to manage. I think we've got the hang of it. We got the hang of it pretty quick, but some of the, you know, quote unquote wear parts have worn out quicker than we thought or hoped, and we've had to deal with them sooner than we wanted to. But I think a few of those systems we talked about, the water system, the hot water system, have really worked out better than I ever would have imagined they would have. I certainly expected a lot more challenges than we saw. And I think, you know, one of the things that's really given us a lot of bang for the buck is not even at Alexander Valley, but at some of our other wineries, which was going into the 2021 season, just really making, you know, as I was talking about culture and making water use a priority, but really sitting down with the team and you know, making sure everybody understood this idea that there's a finite amount of water in the grounds in your winery. So the time to start conserving water is not in August. The time to start conserving water is in, like, you know, March. So every day you're depleting that resource, and at some point you're going to run out. And we have a plan for that. We can deal with that, but it'd be a whole lot better not to run out. So I think really understanding the psychology of these things and helping change people's thought process around them. You know, wastewater was a really interesting one at Alexander Valley, because every winemaker I've ever been around, once it goes down the drain, you know, it's kind of not your problem anymore. You think about it.
Right.
So this was a case where we were putting stuff down the drain, and it said, you know, it's going to be coming right back at you at some point here in the winery. So you got to really think about what you put down the drain, and let's talk about what we can do to mitigate any potential risks there. So certainly stuff like sodium and chlorine were totally off limits. You know, potassium-based cleaners as much as possible. It didn't actually require a whole lot of change to our approach in terms of sanitation, but it was really important to start thinking about, which I do love that about sustainability, is it makes you think about everything. Curiosity is probably the #1 theme when it comes to all of these.
So Ron, I have a question for you, circling back a little bit on some of the research points that you made. And, you know, you mentioned, you didn't go in a lot of detail. You mentioned that you're working on sensors and automation. And I wondered whether you could just give like a sneak peek of, you know, what kind of sensors you're working on to give what type of automation in the winery, something that, and what do you think is a feasible timeline for these things to potentially actually be available for application?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can just mention some of the sensors that we have right now in the teaching and research winery. Some of these are on the 500-gallon fermenters, or we have capability for them. I mean, some of the first ones that were placed in there were, the pressure transducer sensors for being able to follow the fermentation, remotely. And so there's definitely, some calculations that people need to do to make sure that they have sensors that are precise enough for the tank sizes that they have. But again, this, kind of going back to my comments at her question to Nate, just maybe even ballparking how much it would take somebody to go around the winery and spend taking bricks 2 times a day. And, could that person be used somewhere else if we had these technologies? And again, this requires some capital investment that maybe not everyone has. There's also been work on developing sensors so that we could monitor phenolics and extraction, both potentially during pressing of white wine grapes, but also during fermentation. And so again, envision that as maybe complementing, of course, a winemaker's taste of these wines, but, giving, again, sort of an indication of what the extraction level might be. And maybe then you would take a sample and get a more robust number in a lab setting, or at least giving someone some indication to go out and taste that. Again, maybe when there's a shortage of labor and you can't necessarily get through all of the tanks in the time frame that you want. And then I guess most recently, we've been starting to work with redox potential probes and really understanding kind of what those values are giving. And it's actually provided a lot of insight. And so again, with a publication that came out last year, one of the things that a couple of the things I guess that we were not expecting was one, seeing sort of the, ability to monitor changes in sort of the redox potential during a cold soak period, maybe providing some information about either the state of enzymes or microorganisms. And that was different by vineyard site. And then also, the impact of some of our additions, kind of once fermentation was starting. And I know other wineries that have started to use redox potential have seen sort of different outcomes, say, especially, in the instances of wildfires where their practices were somewhat impacted. But they had these sensors in some of their tanks. And so it made them think, I think, a little bit about what their operations were and how that might be impacting or changing their outcomes.
So I know we have about 7 minutes left, and I just want to give you an idea for people on the call of some upcoming campus, some upcoming programs, some on campus and some hybrid. On March 16th, we have Grapevine Red Blotch Disease Symposium. That's going to be hybrid, both in person, on campus, and live stream. And I think Caroline hopefully can put a link in the chat to that event. She did already. There it is. Thanks, Caroline. And then on April 8th, we have Evaluating the Impact of Grape Smoke Exposure Best Practices. That will be an on-campus event. And so there is more info on all the upcoming events on our website. If you go to our website, wineserver.ucdavis.edu, and go to the events link, you can see all the upcoming events. I have a philosophical question. Oh, first of all, I should say before I forget, I also want to thank Karen and Caroline for organizing the event today. We, Anita and I, kind of come here and show up and we get to ask questions and have fun, but without the work that Karen and Caroline do, along with Anita and the other people doing extension, we can't put on events like this. So thank you to them. I have a philosophical question. We talked a bunch about labor and labor savings today, and I won't use an example from the wine industry. I'll use an example from biotech. And I know that there's a local biotech company that they were worried about labor, and so they created facilities that were almost completely automated. And they did reduce the number of operators on the floor considerably, but they found that in order to operate that facility, they now needed a whole bunch more expensive computer science people and control systems people. And so in the end, it didn't necessarily cost them less. They just were hiring different kinds of people, and those people were more expensive. So my philosophical question for you is, how do you know how much automation is the right automation so that you don't displace your current workers that you actually have? And how do we get those people or people who are displaced the right training to be able to, instead of being the ones hauling hoses around, they're the ones that can actually fix all that automation? And so that's a question for both of you.
Let me note that Dave is the one that asked the hard questions today.
So I think in commercial wineries, we've seen that to some extent, especially as equipment has become more advanced. So moving from switches and timers to PLCs in a lot of cases while often the interface is intuitive, it's not always everybody's ball of wax, so to speak. Even payroll systems clocking in and out, the use of technology is something that people just really can't ignore. I have thought at times about what else we could automate. I know certainly the bottling process at wineries much larger than us is quite automated. Warehousing can be quite automated. None of those are really kind of in the cards for us. I don't think we're not quite at the size where we need a super high speed line. We bottle, our longest bottling run is probably about 2 months, a little over 2 months. And then, stuff like barrel work, it's difficult to imagine exactly how it could be automated completely. So I don't know that in our industry, at least the way that I see it and view it, that there's a huge risk of displacing too many people. Now, at the same time, we're trying to figure things out because labor is only so available. And I think there is a reality that people that are going to be displaced, they're going to have to develop new skills. And I wish I had a really good answer for that question, but it's not just industry and it's not just professional. It's talking to people about developing technology skills and being able to use a computer and the internet. It seems like in order to do just about anything these days, you have to be capable of doing that. So maybe the community college system is a good place to start. Maybe the high school and vocational system is a good place to start. I'm not totally sure about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a difficult, there's not a good answer to it. I mean, I think you're saying, Nate, right now, there's, I think, plenty of work still for the people that you can get in a winery, but this is probably the time to start thinking about, like you're saying, working with community colleges and other training institutions to say, how do we train someone to maintain a highly automated bottling line, or to maintain PLC systems that are doing our automated pump overs or cleaning or whatever it is, or harvesters, or any of the other automated equipment in the vineyard. Yeah, I mean, we've started having some of those conversations, but this is probably the time to do it while there's still plenty of work for the people who want to be working in wineries.
I've been quite impressed with mechanical harvesters, and it almost seems as though in many ways once you get somebody driving one of those, they almost drive themselves. So there's some training involved, but then it's probably actually quite a bit easier on an ongoing basis to drive a mechanical harvester, a newer mechanical harvester than a tractor from 1950 probably.
And in the chat, I think we have time for maybe just this question in the chat. I think, Nate, you were talking about how you didn't know how you could get around automating the use of barrels, but Jason in the chat said, how about switching over from use of barrels to oak alternatives? And is that a viable option for some of what we do?
I think it is and it isn't. It's a stylistic shift and certainly something that in some cases the cost structure and the market demand it, and that's the way it is. And there's certain wine styles that will continue to be aged in traditional oak barrels of various sorts, so certainly it's something that is a possibility. I think for wineries like us, for Silver Oak, for example, unless I would have to say that we'll move away from oak barrel aging, kicking and screaming. Maybe someday it'll be absolutely necessary, but it would be one of the last things we would move away from, in my opinion.
Well, we're 1 minute past 2. So as we try to be very timely, and I supposedly have a meeting at 2, I'm going to close. I want to thank Nate and Ron for a very, very interesting conversation today. I've done some work in sustainability and I've learned quite a few things today. So I hope everybody else learned at least one new thing that they didn't know and have one idea of something that they could potentially apply in their own backyards. And that's the idea of having a conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Dave, my co-chair. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Caroline, for doing all the technological stuff that I suck at. And everyone, we'll let you know when we have our next office hours, episode 20. We don't know when it would be yet or what it would be about, but surprise, surprise, we will let you know.
If you have ideas, you can just let us know. Email
Yes,
Karen or one of us, and we're happy to put together programs that help you.
Otherwise, we'll have on-campus events, 16th of March, 8th of April, and I hope to see some of you there. Thank you very much. It was great seeing names, at least on the screen. Thank you. Bye.